Thank you very much. Welcome everybody to the 14th session for the Future Teacher, and we're looking at designing appropriate assessments. The fish will become more prominent as we go on, so just keep that fish in your head and the tree behind it. If we can very quickly look then at what we want to cover, because the fish comes from Albert Einstein. Everybody's a genius, he says. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but I get the gist of it. The key thing is, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. And I think there are a lot of our students, and indeed there's probably quite a lot of us, that think we are stupid because of something that we tried at some point, and we were assessed in some way that actually knocked our confidence rather than building our skills. So, and just in terms of an overall intro to the session, this is part of the Future Teacher series, so that means there's another 13 that you can look at, and they are part of a bigger picture, taking people on journeys. They're all Creative Commons resources. You can use any of them, use the recordings, use the Xerti learning objects that accompany them, and many of them, in fact most of them, still have live elements in them, so if you use them with your own staff, you'd be able to carry on contributing to Padlets or Google Forms and so on. This session we're going to try to recognize that we've got a range of people. Some will be very familiar with these webinars. We'll try not to have you bored and give you plenty of things you can look at if there's something that you already know. Equally, we are aware that there'll be people who won't have done a webinar before. So well, I'm not going to guarantee that we won't go fast. We will go fast, but we will try to go fast in a way that still clarifies to you what we're going to do in terms of the technology, which is generally that most you'll ever have to worry about is having two windows open. That I think I can promise. So without further ado, this is the three of us. You don't really need to know what we look like. So and that's about the existing resources, which you might like to come back and look at again if you aren't already familiar. But now is the time we'd like you, in the chat pane, there is going to appear learningapps.co.uk/assessment. If it's not there already, there we go. In fact, Ron's given you a slightly longer. The learningapps.co.uk is the shorter one. So we would like you to go into the chat pane, and we'd like you to open up that resource. So we give you 20 seconds or so to open that, and you should open at this page, because this is the point where we're going to be juggling between those two panes, just because we want you to be able to actively engage with us with what we're doing. So Ron's going to show here's our suggestion of how you might do that. Is this Ron's suggestion of how we might do that? Yep. So we've got the Zoom pane, which Ron's demonstrating here. The Zoom pane, he's organizing and shrinking to fit on one side of the screen, and then equally you can move around the Xerti object to have on another part of the screen. It's not quite possible for Ron to show it in its entirety, because obviously that would involve a certain amount of, I think, some sort of metacognitive dissonance going on there.
Yeah, Lisa, I agree. I mean,
pains within pains.
Yeah, Lisa, different tools have different amounts of user friendliness, shall we say, or functionality. But yes, absolutely.
If anybody has joined late, we are opening up the resource for the session, and I'll just ask Ron to pop that in there again if you have just joined in. And again, if anybody notices people joining later, they will need to see that. So without further ado, we're now going to be looking at what you said, because we ask at registration what sort of things you want to cover. Partly that helps us to kind of plan the session, to weave a route through what people want to see, but it also gives you an opportunity to see where you are in relation to almost the community of practice. Are the questions you're asking the same questions other people are asking? Are you perhaps at a more sophisticated level of questioning? are other people further ahead. And so there's a real learning that can go on. We're not going to go through all of those now, because you can come back to this Xerte object at any point and look through it yourself. What we will say, though, is that you'll find on the mind map, which is the next slide, and again, you may like to follow us on that, because when you get to the mind map, you'll find we've put a sort of analysis, a structured framework of what your comments were. So we've taken from all the 90 registrations that we had, we've taken the kinds of assessments that people use. That's a really good thing for you to have a look through and say, oh, I haven't thought about that. It's a great opportunity. If you're using the mind map yourself, up on the top left of the screen, there's a plus and a minus, which will allow you to zoom in or zoom out. We won't cover everything in the mind map, but the mind map is a really good tool for you to use in conjunction to this live webinar when you go back afterwards and look at it, because for all those different areas, we've got hyperlinks, we've got notes, we've got all sorts of things that you can follow through. So where do we go from here then?
I think it's me, but just another note about the mind map. It's a peek into our brains as well, because we first start organizing these webinars by three of us getting together, and we pile our ideas into a mind map. And then what we've done, obviously, is to also look at what you have said about what you want to learn. And it's quite nice to see that picture changes of what we thought we would want to communicate with you and to what you want to learn. And it's exactly the same process, isn't it? What the teacher perceives and what the student perceives. And that's going to be a theme all the way through in terms of assessment as well. So this Padlet that we're looking at, and there's still opportunity to contribute. If you go to the learning object, you can actually contribute on the page itself by clicking on the little plus on the bottom right, not on the webinar screen, but on your browser. And these are some of the ideas from yourselves, from people who signed up for the webinar. And we see quite a range of expertise represented here, from online exams all the way to Eportfolios and everything in between. So if there's something you know happens in your organization, please do add it to the Padlet, or feel free to ask questions here. You can see there's comment buttons. You can kind of add your questions. You can ask for links, ask for help with resources. But yeah, so feel free to have a look through those. Let's get some response. People can like posts, maybe add a question or two. I'm just going to stay quiet for 10 seconds while people look at that.
I'm gonna time this. I've never heard Lillian quiet for 10 seconds.
While people are looking at that, the question from Paul about the URL /assessment, it's definitely working, Paul, but I'll put the direct link in the text chat one last time. Obviously, people already have the learning object open. Don't open it again, because then I'll have multiple windows. But that's the direct link. That's what the /assessment redirects to.
If you haven't worked out how to interact with the Padlet on your own version of the Padlet in the learning object, so not on Ron's screen, you'll be able to note that at the bottom of every little kind of sticky note thing, there's a like button, and there's also an add comment. So simply click a like if you like a particular approach, or add a comment if you want to ask more about it, or make a comment on it.
So Teresa, will you be adding your transforming assessment link to the Padlet as well? And I'd just like to say on the record, since this is being recorded, that I was quiet for more than 10 seconds, but neither Ron nor Alistair could resist talking, which is really funny.
It's always the way.
So in the interest of time, we may have to move on from this resource, but if you've half engaged, then you already know that you can come back to it and share this with colleagues as well. The good thing about Padlets is you can remake this exercise and have your own colleagues in your organization engage with it. So feel free to use this. And then we're back on to Alistair on appropriate assessments.
So I'll not go through this in detail because, again, you can follow it through yourself. I'll just pick out a couple of points. So is your assessment inclusive? And I think the key thing I'll pick out here is 25% extra time on an essay style assessment that really isn't going to be very easy for me to do anyway as a dyslexic or whatever my particular need might be. Just giving me more time to do an inappropriate assessment isn't actually leveling the playing field. So that's one of many things to think about in there. In terms of rigor, I think there's some quite obvious things that you're going to be aware of, but I know in the FE sector in particular, where a lot of my background is, there are often real issues when we were working together as a team about, well, actually, are we all giving the same marks for the same sorts of things? And more importantly, can unexpected answers, unexpectedly amazing answers that fall completely outside the rubric, how do you actually catch them as well? Under equivalent, there's a whole bunch of points there. Just the one I'd pick out here is if you begin to explore using audio and using video and using professional discussions and things for your assessment, is there a SPAG equivalent, spelling, punctuation and grammar? So are there literacies to do with audio or to do with video or to do with communication and discussion? Are there the sorts of things that we would notice in an essay? Are there similar things? And if there are, should you do anything about them? The authentic, again, these are things that are really well worth exploring, particularly, I think Lillian will say more about Biggs later on, but I loved the quote about not giving the usual exam where they just tell me what I told them. They should be telling me how they themselves would apply what I told them to the real world, etc. The last one, I've called this the educultural because it's something that's quite close to my own heart, which is, am I teaching somebody in order to get them a qualification, or am I teaching someone in order to transform the way they look at the world and they look at the subject that I'm passionate about? Now, just an example here, when I did an MA recently in writing for children, I had this brilliant publishing project assignment that we were assessed on. I say it was brilliant not because I did a brilliant one, but because the way the assessment was designed was brilliant. It was incredibly open-ended. And the particular one that I ended up doing involved me setting up a Twitter account and looking at how, as a professional writer, I might use social media to develop a network, to develop a presence. And that has resulted in 3 years worth of daily dog walk haikus. And I know some people here very kindly follow them and like them sometimes. But for me, that was a fantastic assessment because it changed my culture, it changed my habits and my lifelong learning that grew from that. There's a collection here of some key bodies that you might want to look at. I'm not going to talk through any of these, but just to let you see that there's the JISC research, there's some JISC mail lists, there's the CEA, there's plenty of others as well on the mind map, but I wanted to show you some of those because those are well known, they are generic, and they've got some fantastically detailed information if you want to drill down into those. I think we're back to Lillian now.
Sorry, I was muted for a little bit. So lovely set of resources. Now, something I was saying to my boss this morning, it's like we're all guilty of collecting a lot of resources, but what do we do with them? And I was conscious of that as I was creating this Padlet, that obviously I could have created this in as a Xerte learning object, but what I thought was more useful was to allow you to continue adding to this resource in some way, shape or form, and also to Padlets allow you to remake them and use it in your own organization so that your staff can interact with the resource. So, one thing that I was conscious of, that many of you asked for ideas for different assessments or better ways of assessing students. So that was the perspective that I was coming from. I went and looked, and Alistair very kindly added the GIST perspective on that. I went wide and I looked at what was already out there in terms of the resources that I use as a practitioner when I'm supporting my colleagues in designing assessments. So the first thing I always start with is learning outcomes. So that's the first thing that I've put in there as well. A colleague shared with me this very nice visual checklist. I think we all have resources with alternative blooms, verbs, and it's a really good reminder. When I was making this Padlet, I had put on number 3, for instance, I had put consider an appropriate type of assessment. And I took my own advice. I went back to the learning outcomes and I picked something from there so that it was much more active. It was choose. And when you choose something, I can measure and I can assess it. When I tell you to consider something, there's no output around that. So I can't see it and I can't measure it. So I was trying to put a little bit of what I was preaching, if you like, into place here. And it's quite I'm not assessing anybody here, but I think it's a call to action, isn't it? I'm trying to encourage people to not look at this resource as something you pass by, but to actually take it and use it with your colleagues as much as possible. Alistair has already mentioned Big's constructive alignment, and that's really the backbone of any assessment-related exercise, keeping the focus on what the students should be able to do, or delegates should be able to do. So yeah, these resources will hopefully work for you, whether you're a practitioner or whether you are doing kind of staff development at a small team level or even across the whole organization. So the main question really is, can you run? If you scroll down, there's the ABC curriculum design workshop. Can you run a similar workshop to get the whole team thinking about assessment? Can you run tester in your organization? Would you even revise your learning outcomes? It's that kind of thing that we want to encourage you to do. Okay, so thank you. Please keep sharing any themes or ideas on the Padlet, and feel free to use the resource in your own organizations.
Could I specifically ask if Terry, I see Terry Lone's
yes.
been adding things to the chat and he's in the room with us. Terry, if you've got, I know you've got a resource, could you pop that into that Padlet, make sure that your new book gets in there?
Yeah, that piece of wisdom. Lots of people with wise ideas about assessment that we can all learn from. Okay. So then on the next page, we go on to student perspectives, and Alistair mentioned leveling the playing field. It links very nicely to this graphic, which they have recently shared so that we can all use. I think when I first saw this graphic, it really made an impact. It's very, very memorable. If anyone else wants to use it, by all means, follow that link at the bottom where they have clearly asked for you to share it, use it, and let them know how you're using it. But this is a very good example of equality versus equity. So an assessment can sometimes feel like something that's done to the students, but something that we maybe need to focus on, and I think a lot of us do, is assessment for learning. We feel like that, but does the student feel like that? So if you try and do something other than an essay, which is one thing we're trying to kind of encourage people to do, to diversify, they might, students might come back to you about, oh, that's not fair, that's not equal, they're writing a song, I'm writing a 3,000-word essay. So the essay, people keep safe with the essay, and that's like the box on the left. Everybody stood on this essay box, if you like, and it's equality, but is it equitable? Whereas, giving people choice provides that framework for equity, which is represented by the picture on the right. Okay. So we move across the tabs quite quickly. Some ways of creating a bit more equity and to get some buy-in from the students, to bring the students with you if you're trying to diversify assessment, is to use a student partnership model. And this is a nice example in this study where the students were asked to research assessment design. And I think there's no better way of getting the students on board than for them to find out a little bit themselves about the key issues. Choice board, and I'm not sure if Mandy King has joined us. I haven't seen her name on the list, but she added something to the Padlet about her way of delivering a summative assessment where the students have a choice, I think, of a blog, a podcast, and so on and so forth, and a choice of topics as well. That's really quite diverse and has its own challenges in terms of marking, etc. So, what are the advantages and disadvantages of diversifying? And you've got to kind of do that cost-benefit analysis. And in terms of perceptions of equity, again, a very nice study where students' perceptions were, if you like, evaluated and researched. And if your student, Lisa says it looks like her daughter's homework grid. Yes, I think we lose that. We lose that freedom as we get up to university or further education. And maybe it's time to relook or plan them in formative assessment stages so that students kind of get a bit more assessment for learning, into the system. But yeah, another good link to research on how students perceive equity. And the key thing is really conversations with students and having them as partners in the way you engage them in assessment. What's on the next slide, Ron?
So it's me. And it's
right.
the mechanics of question design. So what we're going to do, I'm not going to go through all of these because these are real fun. I love these, but they're things that you want to do on your own in your own time. What we found in some of the sign up registration comments was that people were saying, how can I write better questions? How can I think of more interesting ways of testing students? So on the thing about question design, there's these flip cards. Ron's showing you how they work. So you flip or you go left and right from card to card, and then down the bottom in the middle is the sort of flip from, the poor to the better. So just one more. That's the poor example. Flip it. That's the better example. Onto the next card, and so on. So something to look at on your own is came from the Fair Access for All, I think it was called. And then we've also got one looking at how to take multi-choice in more interesting ways. So here's some poor examples of multi-choice questions. Flip the card to see the better one. And these are from various places, particularly the what used to be a great computer-assisted assessment centre. I love their work. You can now only find them on the Internet Archive, but really well worth looking at. Lots of good stuff to look at there. But how do we go beyond multiple choice without going into essays? And so we've got this resource that you can look at, where just some variations on making multiple choices more rigorous, less prone to, the statistical stochastics of probability. That was quite a nice phrase. I must remember that. So looking at multiple true and false. So there's a bunch of things there, and which of those are true and which of those are false? And in that example, you can work through it and see that actually there's a whole bunch of things. C and E are true, and here are the reasons, and A, B, and D are false. And so this one statement gives rise to 5 completely separate and independent learning tests, as it were. If we look at the assertion reason questions, I love this. I used to do this with history students. We had some great stuff on interpreting historical data. But if we scroll down on that, we can see that here it's very simply. So on that first one, the blood sugar level falls rapidly after hepatectomy. I don't even know if you say it like that. And the reason for that is because the glycogen of the liver, etc. Now, the point is there are 5 potential options for just that first statement that we looked at. So if we just scroll up to the top again, you can see that it might be that the assertion about the blood, whatever it was, doing whatever it did, was true, but it might have been false. It could have been that the reason you gave was true and it explained the assertion, or it could have been that the reason it's true is, the reason that you gave is true, but it's not an explanation of the assertion. So the rigor that gives, so that people can't just sort of click here, 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 and statistically I'll get at least 25% without knowing anything. Suddenly that becomes much more complex. And then the matching questions, again, it kind of opens up multi-choice in ways that are much more interesting if you've got things that you're trying to get. So here we got column 1, 5 statements, column 2, 5 things that I'm testing with, 4 statements, 5 things. So there's a distractor added in there as well. And so again, statistically, it's not just a multiple choice, region of high pressure, so it's got to be one of those 4. Well, it is one of those 4, but it's not a 1 in 5 because I have all these other permutations. So it makes it much harder to gamify in the wrong way the results. So have a look at those in your own time, because they are nice examples, and there's some kind of tips and tricks in there as well. And they're all taken wherever possible. I've shown you where they've come from, and sometimes they've come from fantastic projects that are no longer with us, unfortunately. So I think now it's over to Jeff, and we've been really looking forward to having Jeff talk to us about his work with Eportfolios. Jeff is Mr. Eportfolio, so here you go.
You make me sound like a second-hand car salesman, Alistair. I'm not sure I quite go for that, but there we are. Well, thank you very much. And I just want to take 5 minutes really to go over with you in that time really what an e-portfolio is. Firstly, I think it's worth saying that actually an e-portfolio is a colloquial expression really, or a shorthand expression. These are personal learning spaces, but they're called e-portfolios simply because it's shorter and it's easier to understand. But of course, an e-portfolio is the indexing component of a space that is online, that is built for learning, and it's personal to the individual. It's actually much bigger than simply an e-portfolio, but we'll stick with that term for now. Alice, I'm not sure if I can move my slides on. It would be great. Yes, thank you very much. This is the model of learning that we're used to, and it's something that we're grappling with in the world of education, because the world, as we know, has moved on. Anyone who's got a smartphone with apps on it. We've moved from a situation where technology was shared for the many to actually the technology for the one, which is the next slide again, please. And this is quite important to just get a grip. This is quite important stuff when it comes to what e-portfolios do for us. We've changed here from having a compliance setup where there's one technology and everyone's in it, to where the technology is actually connected to the individual student and teacher. It's very much like anyone who's got a mobile phone with apps on it. It's the idea is that the applications orbit around the individual rather than it sort of being held centrally. And this is quite profound actually, because you can see here immediately students are now much more in control or in command of managing their own learning, and they're actually part of networks of learning rather than sort of being rather more passively held in a sort of a central model of learning. But of course, each now is able to actually narrate inside a personal learning space a unique learning journey. And that learning journey is also not going to be limited simply to what the student gets from attending a course, but from other aspects, both serendipitous and what one might call accidental learning that one can put into a portfolio, so that it ends up, if you like, creating a more of a sort of a rounded individual rather than just showing a list of competencies. It's not so much what someone can do, but it's actually much more important about who they are in all of this. Okay, moving on again. I want to distinguish between two types of portfolio. There are mapping portfolios and there are reflective portfolios or reflection portfolios. And this is the way to think of a mapping portfolio. It's very much like a room that a student is placed in, but the room has furnishings and fittings already available. And the student is given these furnishings and fittings in a lock-up outside, and they're simply told to put them in that room in a certain order and a place in order to create the room. And when the room is created, it looks very beautiful and the job is done. And it's very much sort of the competency model. It's a portfolio that may have 70, 80 competencies listed in it, and the student simply works their way through whatever work they're given to do and hangs the competencies they gain on these hooks in the portfolio. And once everything's done, the qualification is gained. But it's actually quite a limiting kind of piece of technology, and that's probably why there's so many mapping portfolios available, because it's very easy to actually describe what the learning of the student will look like, so you can create the technology to match it. But just moving on again, Alistair, to the next slide. This is what a reflective portfolio looks like, which is a completely empty room. And there is no furniture anywhere. And it's quite frightening for a lot of course leaders and managers, because they're outside looking for the lockup with the bits and pieces that they're going to give to the students. Because what happens is that the student is allowed to choose the furnishings and fittings and fit the room out according to their personal circumstances and needs. And therefore it makes it a much richer experience, and also much more difficult to design the technology that's going to support that, which is why there are very few genuine reflective portfolios available, but a lot more mapping ones out there. But of course, the point about having an open room like this is that the learner is not just simply limited to putting things in there that they get from their formal learning, but they can put other things as well that they feel are important to them, or that are interesting or unique to their story. It also means that they can add things in there that talk about the kind of person that they are. And this is really important. Reflective portfolios are brilliant at helping to capture the personable side of students, the customer-facing areas, if you wish, the kind of skills that employers actually say that they want beyond simply the certificates of competence. I'll give you an example. I did some work a while back with JISC, and something that was very clear to me quite early on was the number of employers that would say to me and say to us that they would very happily employ someone who didn't quite have the right qualifications if they were the right person. And what they meant by this idea of the right person is that they were a more rounded individual. They had the personability skills. They were the kind of student, if you like, that they were happy to place in front of a customer to represent their company. But at the time, of course, there was no mechanism whereby someone who attended a course could actually do that, could actually demonstrate those skills. There was no way that they could build them into their learning. Consequently, with a mapping portfolio on the previous screen, what we have is people that go out into the world that say, hello world, here's my certificate of competence. Whereas with a reflective portfolio, it's much easier to say, hello world, this is me. And by that, I mean the rounded me, the me in all aspects of who I am, but particularly where my learning is something of particular value and importance in a given circumstance. So that's what you get. And for me, I think this is where education is going, because it gives students the opportunity to genuinely take their learning into what one might call a more progressive field and continuous as well. By progressive, what I mean is that every time a student completes an episode of learning, it tells them where to go next, but the student chooses that based on where they are now, rather than embarking on one long line of a particular course that is very linear and starts at the beginning and ends at the end. But a portfolio allows the learner to take a more progressive journey, and also it becomes continuous as well, rather than episodic, because the student can take the portfolio from one place to the next. Can we just move on again, please, Alistair? That's marvellous. Look at that. And this is something else that's actually caused, which I think has happened there's a fork occurred in the e-learning world. It's a kind of a house and cloud division, I think is another way of describing it. But what's happened is that the great properties of technology that allowed for compliance and control and particularly scalability is great, but it started to impinge on the ability of students and teachers to work creatively using the creative powers of technology in the cloud. But we actually need to separate the two, and I'm sort of making a case here for saying why I think that's important. If we keep in the college that which is safe and needs to be kept secure, then it allows tutors and students to move into the cloud space, to be creative in the work that they do, and allow students to genuinely work with these new reflective portfolios. You'll notice that the house route is a learning plan, and that the cloud route is a personal portfolio. There is no room in my world for the VLE. Interesting, if somewhat controversial view, maybe. Moving on again, please, Alistair, because I'm about to run out of time. And if I can just sort of sum up really what I've sort of said to you here. Wally has left the party, as you can see on this slide here. It's no longer the case that students are lost in the crowd, but each is able to distinguish themselves from their classmate and to be able to make a case of who they are as a person, and not just simply as someone who has a common qualification. As a consequence of that, some really good things come out of this. First is that we're nudging students into a more self-managed learning role. They're no longer going to be the kind of passive student that submits a piece of work to a tutor and says, do you like what I've done? As opposed to saying, I think I've done a great job, do you agree with me? And I've made the point about progressive, continuous nature of technology as well. But also that what we now ask students to show us is a list of accomplishments, which is much more personal than just showing a list of competencies. And therefore, you're getting a much richer experience of who the student is and what they have to offer to the world. It's an employability skill. It's definitely a skill for life as well, because everybody in the future will survive, I think, both economically and possibly even in their personal lives, on the quality of the kind of reputation they have in the online world, in the online space, and it needs to be looked after very carefully. And this is a way, through the use of portfolios, that students can begin to develop those skills of developing their digital reputation. And then the round itself as well. That's the case, I think, really. But do think about the difference between mapping and reflective portfolios. Reflective portfolios are the riskier one to go for, but they are by far the more interesting ones, and give far more, I think, scope to students to express who they are and to really make the most of their learning. I think that's it, Alistair, unless there's any questions.
No, that's excellent. I found the first time when you talked us through that, I found that really helpful, and other people have commented there about the, the mapping portfolio and the reflective portfolio and the furnished rooms and unfurnished. That's great. I would just like to say, for the purpose of honesty, that it was Ron moving the slides. I cannot take credit for that brilliant slidesmanship.
I was half tempted to go back to the first slide showing our pictures.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Ron. It's good to work with you again, Ron. I have to say, love it.
And this is a really interesting thing, because I think we ended there, and from the discussion that's been going on as well, we're almost pushing forward. Look, we're in a new world where the social becomes more important, the collaborative becomes more important, and yet a lot of us are still stuck in this world. And on the screen that we have here on this page 17 bit, we're in an area where, because perhaps you're in an FE context and everything's going to be set, all your assessments set by the awarding body, perhaps you're in an HE context and this is just the way it's always been done, it's a written assignment, and perhaps there's a very strong academic case that people have to be able to write reports and essays, and that is it. If that's the case, then what do we do? Is there still a place for technology? And I would argue very strongly that technology can really help us even in those situations. So what I'm going to just very quickly look at these three themes: the feedback and the formative. So the first way in which, if we were to prepare students for traditional assessments and use technology to do that better than we do currently, then there are themes that we've covered in other future teacher sessions, like knowing what they know, the self-assessment and mastery learning. There are themes that will allow us, tools that will allow us to be able to identify what it is that students have problems with, so that we can help teach them better. There are also, I think, there's an important modeling element, where if we're going to be assessing students with a really well constructed document, then maybe our handouts ought to be equally well constructed. Our referencing should show all the good practice. If we're going to assess students through videos, then the videos that we give them should be videos that meet good practice criteria. And from my background, you would obviously expect that to include good inclusive practice, good assessment, and so on. So there are some things that we can do just in terms of making sure that the feedback, the formative, the scaffolding structure is right. In this middle column here, there's some really fun things that I developed with my students many years ago, before Eportfolios were invented, because I discovered that my students, some of my bright students, were just rubbish at writing essays. And I knew what that felt, because that had been exactly what I'd been like as an 18-year-old. And I learned a very hard and not very helpful way, where I just had my tutors set me essay after essay after essay, extra essays in lunchtime, and I was motivated enough to do them. But I was writing 1,000, 1,500 words in order to test a very specific skill. And it struck me that when I was doing this with my own students, that was a complete waste of time. Why do they need to mechanically produce 1,500 words in order to practice the skill of sequencing, the skill of matching an argument to evidence, and so on? So we did a lot of work just using the simplest technology of all, a Word document, where we would take a model essay, but instead of saying that's a model essay, we would scramble it, pop it online, and they simply had to unscramble a paragraph to put it back into a sensible order. They wouldn't all have exactly the same order. They didn't have to have exactly the same order, because they began to understand that the sequence, the flow of an argument could be slightly different and still be perfectly good. And there's other examples there, lots of examples, where we simply deconstructed a good essay and made it not so good an essay and got them to put it back together in a Lego kind of style. It had a huge impact on our student confidence. It had a huge impact on the student outcomes as well. We had one chief examiner come to visit us because she thought we might have been cheating because our student marks were so high above other students who were doing the same exam. There are equally, I think, things we need to think about using technology if we're going to be getting new media type assessments, this third column here, where we might be saying to a student, it's not an essay now, it's a podcast or it's a video clip. We can use different tools in different ways to point them to examples of good design, good practice, bad practice. And just like I deconstructed written essays to help my students, I think we can use tools like Edpuzzles, Xerti Media Pages, or HP5 to be able to help students see that was a good video explanation of bedside manner for doctors or nurses or something, and this is a bad one, and to be able to have independently accessed information, interactive for the students. On the next bit, which we're going to go over pretty quickly, I wanted to start with looking at the issue of plagiarism. Now, we're only going to cover it very briefly, but I did want to tell you how researching for this, I went onto an essay mill service, and I had a delightful, ironic exchange. So I had this live chat pop up where they asked, do I need help with my essay assignment, etc. And I said, no, I'm just researching academic malpractice so I can make recommendations about changes to UK legislation. I thought I'd try to scare them a little bit. Okay, how many words do you need? When do you need it? I said, I'm not writing an essay, doing a report on essay mills and their impact on academic integrity. Would you help write that? Oh yes, we'll write a report for you. Just provide details and deadline and we'll write that for you. And that tickled me, it made my evening. But we see plagiarism as a pest, and clearly it is a pest, but there are various ways we work around it. But I would say it's only a pest if you assess in a particular way. It's also a possibility. And I do think that if we, and you can have a look at that tab and follow through some of the ideas, that's it. Yeah. Plagiarism can help us be creative. Why don't we stop saying that it's the response of a lazy student and begin to think, well, maybe it's actually lazy assessment design. Perhaps we should be encouraging students to go out and find dozens of essays on this topic and actually critique the essays that they've found and use the critique process as the assessment. So they're doing something that's utterly unique, or have an essay mill proof assignment where we're creating an assignment in a non-traditional way, which becomes increasingly difficult to plagiarize. Now, after this, we've covered quite a big area, but I just want us to spend some time with the text chat now. And I want us, and I can see, I'm really pleased Michael said there they don't see plagiarism as a pest. Yeah, and I think that's a really positive thing as well, Michael, using Turnitin to help students improve their writing, to help them think about how to do things. That's great. What I would like you to do now in the text chat, could you just spend just 1 minute, because I've slightly overrun, 1 minute, if you've got anything, well, you must have an example of an assignment that just went wrong. You tried something and it went wrong, because it's one thing talking about creative assignments and assessments. It's one thing me talking about, we did this kind of assessment style, we helped our students and we got great marks. We did. But in the process, we did lots of things that went wrong, lots of things that were bad, and I had space to fail. So just for a couple of minutes, either answer that first question in the text chat. Have you tried something that failed and what did you learn? Or answer the second one. How within your institution would you even consider, in TEF land or Ofsted land, how would you consider and build in the possibility of a failed innovation so that you could actually learn? So anything to add in there? So let's see, fingers on the keyboard. I'll be quiet for 10 seconds.
I'm counting.
I know.
Ah, got you.
You're so devious. So here they come. That's great. Thank you very much. I like that phrase, assessment literacy. And remember, we'll be keeping, the recordings will record the text chat. So, this is a wealth, a rich vein of information. But also be aware that it's also slightly public. So don't do anything that's going to be too embarrassing. I like Jonathan's example there. Yes, quality. And that's a problem doing poetry at the best of times. Never mind.
Maybe 10 people working on one was the challenge. Maybe if you were to rework that, maybe try it again as pairs or 3 people first and see if that helps.
I like the point that Mohammed's made there about video assessment being problematic for different types of students, and I think that is something where it's not necessarily a fail, because I think there are ways around it, but sometimes you don't even begin to realize that these are going to be issues until you've tried it and you've had a student just clam up entirely. So there's some great things there. Do keep those popping in as we go on to the last few slides.
Rebecca makes a very interesting point. The possibility of failure is a big barrier to making changes, but in a sense, the current assessment methods are failing some people now. So it's coming from a safe zone where it's like the boiling frog analogy, isn't it? I guess some of our resources here, hopefully, Rebecca, you'll find useful to just engage people in discussing, Alistair's words about it being inclusive, rigorous, authentic, some of these educultural, I'm sure he's made that word up, but some of these things are quite useful starting points for conversations about assessment, and also looking at learning outcomes and stuff like that. So hopefully you'll find some of them very useful, and I especially really like Alistair's idea of turning the essay mill thing on its head and turning it from a threat to an opportunity. So getting students to judge essays written by essay mills is a very nice exercise, criticality, and also gets you the reflective evidence that you want.
And Lillian, I think yours is the next slide, as we sort of we're on the home straight now. So
yeah, so just very quickly, this was a key request for us to all look together at reducing the burden of assessment. And so the first thing that came to my mind, obviously, was this idea of using. It's surprising how many colleagues don't mark using a rubric, or they might have standards of levels of achievement, but they don't apply it to different criteria in a structure. So it's very, very important that you kind of get your colleagues to look at this, or if you're a teacher, to look at this yourself if you co-mark with others. And David Nicol, who does quite a lot of work on feedback and assessment, gives some very good advice. And this study by Jones et al., 5 steps to making sure that students understand what you are looking for, so that they learn through the assessment process as well. Different methods of assessment. University of Reading has a very nice site there that suggests, for instance, that if a particular assessment method is getting too unwieldy, don't forget, for some of us, we're scaling up from 100 students to 400 students to 1,000 students. You can't possibly use the same assessment methodology. How can it possibly work? So you do have to rethink assessment methods sometimes. So they've got some advice on that. And then reducing assessments. Now, that's very brave, but that's exactly what one university is actually doing. They're looking at assessment across a program to make sure students aren't being over-assessed. We have a program map, and from this program map, you can tell if different modules are hitting the same learning outcome. So if you have like 10 modules contributing to a program, and you actually look down the map and you can see that the one particular learning outcome is being assessed 10 times, then maybe that's overkill. Maybe the emphasis should change for certain assignments to give students that stretch across a range of abilities as well. So if you have other ideas around reducing the burden of assessment, there's a Padlet link at the top. Please, this is something that obviously is quite close to all our hearts. We don't want to overmark. We don't want to spend all our time marking. Do pop in any ideas, any current practice you're aware of. It'd be lovely to kind of find out what people are already doing. Okay. So the next bit really is considering your skills development. Now this is drawing us to a close now. I'm sorry, I kind of missed out some of your chats. But thank you very much for engaging. I'm just looking at Ellison's text there. Important to remain authentic to the discipline. Absolutely. And one easy way to do that is, I don't know many researchers who are currently doing research who aren't promoting their research in some way, shape, or form to a public audience. It seems to be tied up to part of their work now, part of the funding as well. And that's one way to bring authenticity into any kind of research. You're not just writing an essay, you're having to communicate it, what you're researching, to people. So that is one way for some of these more academic disciplines to bring in some real life skills, if you like, working skills. So as part of your participation here, you have sorry, who's that? I'm not sure if someone's trying to join us and give us some feedback. Okay, so the DigComp Edu framework, this is what we're working to on the Future Teacher program to try and help you. Ron, do you mind clicking the image to enlarge it? To give you some way of mapping your experience, your experience with us against a framework. So you can see the big quadrant on assessment there at the bottom. So this is a European framework of competencies for educators, and clearly assessment is quite a big focus. It's almost a quarter of the whole thing, but wrapped up around it, on the left you've got your professional competencies, and on the right you've got your learner competencies. And that's to remind us that as we develop in our understanding of assessment, we're upskilling ourselves, but we also have to bring the students along with us and upskill them. And that's that from the DigComp Edu, and that links into our program at the Future Teacher Conference. Ron, do you want to sell the Future Teacher Conference?
Well, we can all sell it. One of the things that those of you that have been joining the webinars as we've been doing them throughout the last year or so will know that we've been creating very rich resources, and they're all available for you to use, and we put the link in the text chat already for those. But what we've also been developing is kind of mini courses, and a digital thermometer and a digital compass that helps practitioners work out what mini course they should follow next. And we have a conference where we're launching those materials. So it's all the resources that we've used for the webinars, plus much more, and all structured in a journey type way, a mini course, if you like. And we'd certainly be keen to see many of you at the conference. You can see the link on the screen there to your learning object to book, and we have some guest speakers, as you can see listed on the top there, and many more resources to share. And a lot of that is a large part of the objectives of the project, is to not only share for consumption, but for share for repurposing and reuse. Anything else you wanted to add, Lillian, while we move on just quickly to the couple of slides?
No, but just the fact that it's in York, it's in gorgeous York, and at that time of year, it's really, really nice to huddle together and see the whites of each other's eyes. And so we're not running a webinar that month, but it's a really nice time to get together with other like-minded people and work on, just to get together and talk learning technology.
Jonathan's provided enough to help there, Lillian, so we'll...
Oh, excellent.
Just very quickly, we'll skip past. We do have an activity for everybody just to do before you leave, but just to go through the last couple of pages in the learning resource that... as Lillian mentioned, we don't have a webinar. We don't have a webinar in December for obvious reasons, and we're skipping the webinar in January because of the conference. But you'll be able to see and view the resources and the webinars that we're doing for the rest of 2019 early in the new year, and we'll be saying a lot more of that at the conference if you're able to attend. We always have this last page that kind of summarises that the resources created with Xerti, and those of you familiar with Xerti will know it's an excellent tool for all sorts of assessment activities. The one thing we always ask people to do before they leave is just to share in the text chat one thing you would do as a result of what we've discussed today. And I think there's usually a lot of things that we've discussed and a large number of possible activities, but even more so possibly today than some of the other resources and webinars that we've done. So try to be unique in terms of, yes, of course, you revisit the learning object, but we'd like to hear the very specific things you might do as a result of what we've discussed.
I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to email Jonathan now with his offer of help.
He's going to so regret that. But he'll enjoy being part of the fun.
No, absolutely. He's got, I think we love meeting everybody as well.
Yeah,
and
there's a lovely buzz about it, great team. So
just to pick up, Paul there has said learn Xerti as an action. During the conference day, we're actually, I'm going to be running a Xerti session, but not just a how to use Xerti session, but a how to use and repurpose all the resources that we made available. So if you like some of the resources or you like sections of them, we're going to have a dedicated session at the conference to download and tweak those and make them your own and make them relevant to your learners, your organizations.
Wow, Sandra, that's very powerful. That's great. But I like what Lisa's doing. She's doing what she can control. She's got no control over the summative, but she can do something in the formative to help students.
Debbie, it'll be great to... Debbie's saying that she's hoping to come to the conference. That'll be great. We love doing these online things, but it's so much more powerful when you can meet face to face, sit in a room together, do something together, share together, have a coffee together. So we're really excited about getting together with a lot of people, and we'd love to see anybody that can come. And also encourage colleagues, particularly colleagues that are a little bit technophobic, a little bit worried about, is this just a trend? People that are rooted in traditional pedagogy. We love people rooted in traditional pedagogy, because if you can win their hearts and minds, then the things they can do with just a few technical skills are amazing. So bring your skeptics, bring your friends.
Knowing Terry, you must have been champing at the bit Terry, to open your mic and say a few things. So an opportunity now while people are signing out to do exactly that if you wish. And likewise, Sarah, I know Sarah's joined us. If you're on the mic, Sarah, you can talk about your book as well.
And Terry.
Yeah, and Terry.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Hello, so I'm obviously Sarah, not Terry. A couple of years ago now, I worked on a project with a bunch of colleagues who work for the Bloomsbury Consortium, which is made up of 6 institutions, and Steve Hirons, who's on this call, he was one of our wonderful academics who authored a chapter. So all of his work on using Panopto and video for assessments is a chapter that appears in our book. So the book is a culmination of the project. The first few chapters are basically pieces of research that we conducted. We looked at distance learning colleagues and how they make use of assessment, technology-based assessment. We talked to our administrators who have a key role in the workflow and the life cycle of assessments, and found out what their pain points were and how they resolved these. And then the case studies all represent many different sorts of innovative examples of how people are collecting feedback from their students, assessing assignments. Many of the contributors didn't even think what they were doing was particularly innovative. It was just something that they did by choice. But it's a really great collection, and I'll put into the chat the link. It's a free book. Be one of the 2,000 people that have already downloaded it.
Oh, wow, great. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, hi, Terry. Yes.
Hi, and nice to be here. I'm currently working on a book which will be called Game Over, and it's a call to abolish GCSE exams as a method of spreading out from that 16 plus focus to really get rid of the focus on standardized testing and linear measurement across all learning. So that's what I'm doing, folks. But you have to retire before you really become a radical, I think.
Terry, can you take it down, not just GCSEs, could you take it down to all these other tests? Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2?
Absolutely, and that becomes a tactical decision. But I'm convinced with the other people I'm working with that somehow the 16 plus thing is the tactical focus to work on. Yeah, I'm very concerned about the mental health issues surrounding teenagers and their learning.
Thank you very much.
Okay, at this point, we usually have a kind of little informal chat reflecting on the webinar as people leave, and some people lurk and some people go off to get their lunch before they leave. But so please do sign out whenever you can. Thanks for attending. And Alistair, Lillian, do you want to say any last thoughts?
No, but if anyone else would like to help us out with future webinars, do drop us a line. I think sometimes we can be guilty of saying too much, and we definitely want to plan things where we have more input from more people. So do drop us a line if you can participate and present a segment in future. That'd be great.
And in fact, the next we're going to be looking at learning design in the next couple, I think.
Off the top of my head, I can't remember. I'm going to have to look it up. But
okay, well, don't worry.
Yeah,
we'll certainly let people know, and
yeah,
and also join the Future Teacher mailing list. I think Ron's talked about that already. Future Teacher mailing list is where we'll keep you in touch with everything that we're doing. And it's a great place to have some discussions as well. So have a good afternoon, everybody.
Yeah. I'm just busy downloading Sarah Sherman's book.
That's 2002. Yes, Alicia, there will be a recording of this webinar. It's normally a few days between getting it processed and getting it up on the website, but Ron will have that up there.
Yeah, I was going to say, I said Jeff will say if he was here, when will you make the recording available, Alistair?
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
It'll be next week sometime.
Yep. Luciana, it would be great if you can come to York. So, yeah, do have a look at the link. Have we got the link to the
Thanks, Rebecca. Oh, the future teacher link.
The link to the
conference.
Conference.
FT30 UK conference. Ta-da!
There we go. Bit.ly.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for your comments, guys. I'm glad you found it useful. Would love to meet as many of you as possible and to see you in future teacher webinars. Don't forget to tweet. We can tweet. We don't often encourage people to tweet, but we should do. If you have enjoyed, leave us a tweet. Part of our social learning experience, isn't it?
Yeah.
Evidence of learning or participation or customer satisfaction, all available via Twitter. Yeah.
The hashtag's in the text chat.
Yep.
Sarah, that's FT30 UK.
And I'm interested, just as people are leaving, just seeing Rianne's comment there about it's so important, different education sectors, awarding bodies, etc., collaborate and involve chalk-faced staff. I think one of the things that we often inherit is almost a legacy mindset of what assessment is like, because I remember what most of my assessments were like when I was doing A-levels and GCSEs, and they were very narrow. It was only, you know, as a teacher myself, getting frustrated at marking boring stuff because I was setting boring assessments. It was only that began to make me think, you know, how can I do this differently? But even then, I was still constrained by what the board wanted. But
I was very lucky that I did a degree in graphic design, so it was very portfolio based,
right.
and it was all everything was working. You know, you have to create your portfolio all through your degree, so it really made me laugh that people found it so hard to design work that was based around a kind of portfolio idea, because I'd experienced it, and I kind of thought, well, that's just real life, isn't it? How often are we asked to write 13,000 words as part of our work?
No,
rarely, very, very rarely. Maybe if you're an academic, because you have to publish journal articles and but even then they're peer reviewed. So how often do we ask our students to have their work peer reviewed? Because that's real life in academia.
Yeah.
So that's quite interesting.
It's also real life in lots of vocational areas as well. You know, you have your idea, this is how I'm going to set up my hairdressing salon, but you talk with your colleagues about it, and they say, no, that's no good like that. Yeah, have it this way, it'll be much better. And
it's quite interesting how it doesn't marry up with and I guess, like I say, maybe we have certain ideas and skills that are tacit now, and it's hard to recognize how other people haven't yet learned that particular skill set, because they've come through different experiences, you know. So we have a lot to learn when we talk to our, everybody in the webinars. I find I'm always kind of like, oh, I hadn't thought about it from that point of view before. I love it. I love the stretch it gives me when I find out other people's perspectives or what is a challenge for them.
On that note, I'm going to stop the recording. I left it